Hi, everybody. It's Deirdre Fay, and I am thrilled to have the chance to talk to Chris Willard, who is a colleague of mine in the Boston area, but I don't get to see him much because he's out traveling and teaching and doing incredible stuff in the world. And he does a lot with teens and children, an area that is just not my area, partly because I just don't understand how to work with people that have such difficulties, and kids can just be so flooded and in so much pain, and that has left me like not knowing what to do. So I have always been grateful for people like Chris who have ventured into the territory and work with kids and teens. So we're going to talk about his amazing books. He has like 11 books out there, so you have a whole panoply of things to look for. But the one I wanted to focus on today was this one, Alphabreaths. When I saw this, I just was delighted. It was like my own inner child came forward, and just pure delight at looking at some of these. I mean, the illustrations are fantastic for one thing, but how he's tied in simple things to, like this one, cake breath, like blowing out candles on a cake. Like, what a brilliant idea for just simple things about breath. Breathe in as you imagine a birthday cake. Breathe out as you imagine blowing out the candles. Like how simple that is, and delightful. And it just makes it so accessible to any of us, not just our inner kids, but all people. So Chris, what inspired you like to start working with mindfulness with kids especially, and then to find these unique and wonderful ways to contribute to all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, Deirdre, thank you so much for having me on. This is really fun because it's crazy. Our offices are probably like 2 miles apart, and yet like you're in Boston right now and I'm in London. So anyway, it's good that we're hanging out. And this is really fun. I love just getting a chance to talk about this book that Daniel and I created together. It's funny, I've done a bunch of books, and you've written books, and they take years and years and years and are exhausting. And then this book, I got the idea and I called up my friend Daniel, because Daniel Rechtschaffen's the other author. I'd learned some of these practices from him. And I said, do you want to do this thing together? And he said, sure. And we basically wrote it in about 15 minutes in a phone call. And what we're really doing is actually, we came up with a few of our own practices. What's really fun is that a lot of these are things that kids have come up with themselves. And what's been really fun, actually, even since we created the book, is watching the ways kids are using these practices and then expanding on them and evolving them and having them go in these new directions. And it's just been so unbelievably fun, obviously, just on all those levels. And of course, Deirdre, you were saying, how's adult therapy different than kid therapy? One of the things I think is always true with whoever we're working with is we can tell people what to do, and they sometimes do it, right? But insight comes, real behavioral change starts to come when someone has the insight themselves, or they think maybe that they've had that insight themselves, right? In that therapeutic process. And with adults, that's in a conversation. And with kids, it's often through things like play. So what's cool is like kids making up their own breaths, kids coming up with variations on these things, and then they really start to use them. And that's where it gets so cool and so delightful and so fun, just, as a therapist and as a writer, to be watching this stuff. So that's a little bit about kind of what's been fun about the book. And yeah, I've been doing the kind of mindfulness in kids thing for a while now. I never heard the word mindfulness when I was a kid, and now it's everywhere for adults, and it's really cool to see how much this is spreading to young people. I mean, I've been going to like consulting at preschool conferences as well as elementary school conferences and high school and the college level, and just seeing, the simplicity, but the power of teaching kids how to self-regulate with the breath. And it's like, if we can teach kids how to regulate their breath, then they're learning how to regulate their bodies, and they're learning how to regulate their physiology, and ultimately having some influence over how they can regulate their emotions, their impulses, their ability to focus. So it's just such a gift to be able to be in this world and trying to contribute and just have fun at the same time.
That's a wonderful thing, certainly, to have this brought together. And what do you do? You know, because my area spends so much around trauma and attachment wounding. How do you do it when kids are so broken, or teenage, you know, where they feel like the way to regulate themselves is to stop breathing? So how do you introduce play in that way?
I think what we're trying to do is make it fun. And like so many things in more of the CBT tradition, or I think in the mindfulness world, the deep tradition has always been, let's do an experiment and let's see what happens, right? Let's investigate this phenomenon, we'd say, in mindfulness, or like, let's look at our experience and do a little scientific method on it in the CBT world. Apologies, I've got this terrible cold. And that's something, that's the way I try to introduce it. Like, so let's see what happens if we do together 3 hot chocolate breaths, right? Imagine you're smelling the hot chocolate, breathing in and blowing out, pulling it off. Let's do 3 of these and see what happens. Notice how your body feels before, and notice how your body and your mind feel afterwards. And sometimes you get an eye roll. In fact, a lot of times you get an eye roll, right? You get that from grown-ups too, right? But
probably more.
That we kind of offered as an experiment. Okay, so what do you notice? Actually, you know what? My head does feel a little bit more clear. I do feel a little bit more settled than I did. During that 3 breaths we did, I wasn't thinking about this difficult experience, or I wasn't thinking about what's happening next or what happened yesterday or something like that. And then we start to try to build a bit from there. And my goal is not like kids are going to be sitting on a cushion for hours on end. I mean, that'd be great, right? But it's like, you know, with this book, for example, or some other things I've done, it's like, you know, if I can offer kids one positive experience of mindfulness or breath work or something like that, right, then maybe that seed has a chance to grow so that when they reach that moment that they really need it, right, when this stuff really hits the fan, I don't know what I'm allowed to say on your podcast, right, or whatever it is, right, they can go back and think, oh, I liked that cake breath. I liked that moment where we just felt our feet on the floor or we listened to sounds. That was a moment of peace. How can I get back to that? And the seed is there for another therapist to maybe water at some point along the way. And the other thing about attachment also, you know, one of the practices is join your breath, which is join your breath with whoever you're doing it with. But it goes back to what kids need really is an adult in their life who's practicing mindfulness, right? What's the biggest predictor of resilience? If you look at a kid's giant list of ACEs, of adverse childhood events, right? Trauma, abuse, neglect, alcoholism in the family, moving, immigration, right? So many different things, right? Facing racism. So many things our kids are facing, adverse childhood events. Well, what predicts that they're going to succeed? Those kids that are resilient ultimately is having stable, predictable adults in their lives. And sometimes that's the therapist, or that's another adult who's maybe sharing mindfulness. And so it goes back to, are we regulating ourselves and then co-regulating with that kid or with that teen so that ultimately they learn to internalize that process and learn how to self-soothe, learn how to self-regulate. But often it is our job for a while to be that regulation for them until they can learn how to internalize those skills. So it keeps coming back to us.
Chris, you want to take a break and have a glass of water or something?
I'm all right. We can keep going. Yeah.
I want to take care of you over there.
Thank you. I'm in England. There's plenty of tea, right?
Right. Well, I also know you have a new book out, the Mindfulness Matters Program for Children and Adolescents. So tell me what inspired that book.
So this is a project I've been thinking about for a long time. I wrote this with my friend Randy Semple, who is, I think, the best writer and researcher on mindfulness with kids that's out there. And she doesn't get as much attention as she should. I've known about Randy since I was in graduate school, looking up research for what became my dissertation and became my first book. And I read her dissertation and I was like, this woman's incredible. And we've stayed in touch. And finally, we had this opportunity to write together, and our writing styles really dovetail. So what Randy, she's a clinician and she's mostly a researcher and creator of different programs. And what she and I were talking about was when we started the book, there's maybe 80 different curricula out there for kids. I'm sure there's well over 100 at this point. Well, the problem with trying to teach kids mindfulness in a systematic way, like we do with adults in MBSR or mindfulness-based self-compassion or some kind of manual, is that kids, right, it's really hard to do a group with kids because times are different. They've got baseball practice this day and their parent can give them a ride that day. We tried in school. Well, different schools say, okay, you can have 15 minutes for mindfulness once a week. Another school says, you can have an hour once a month. Everyone says something different. So any curriculum that's out there, it ends up falling apart. The wheels come off because it's not adaptable to the environment. So I was kind of thinking about this as I'm not going to ask you how old you are, Deirdre. When I was growing up, there were these terrible books, but they were called Choose Your Own Adventure. And it was like you turn to page 5 and you decide, do you want to turn to page 8 or page 9, depending on your decision. And that was kind of what gave us the idea for the structure of this program, which is like, say you're dealing with you've got 5 weeks with kids with serious trauma and attachment, then you go to this chapter and you kind of choose your own adventure of maybe like these 8 or 10 different lesson plans that you can do. Or say you've got depressed 15-year-olds. Well, here's your choose your own adventure over here.
I love that you're gamifying it.
Exactly. It's like it's a game hopefully for the kids, but it's a game anyway for the therapist.
Right. That's important too, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's hopefully something that can be flexible to meet kids where they are and with whatever the setting is. Right? Are you in a forensic setting, or are you in a public school? Are you in a private school? Right, maybe in a synagogue or Hebrew school, or maybe in something like that. There's so many different places someone could use that curriculum. So that's what initially inspired us to put this curriculum together. And it's got 70 different lesson plans or something like that. So we're hopeful about that, and I think Randy's going to be doing the research on it too, which is exciting.
Right, to see how it plays out. And where do you want to go from here, given this whole big world that you're creating? What's next for you?
For me, well, before we got on, we were talking about doing clinical work versus doing trainings, and it's funny to be at a point in my life where I'm actually stepping away from clinical work in a lot of ways. I still do 2.5 days of clinical work with kids, teens, and young adults, and of course, working with kids means working with families, working with systems, which is the bulk of the work. But I'm having fun exploring other kinds of ideas. My wife and I are working on some other kids' books about mindfulness that are honestly kind of inspired by just interactions with our kids. I've got a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old who are out at the park at the moment. I'm doing other things. I'm really interested in young adults. I got really interested in mindfulness when I was about 20, 22 years old. And there's such a massive crisis in mental health in our college students and generally in kids of that age, whether they're in college or not. Some of that's biological, but a lot of that I think is the pressures we're putting on young people these days that are taking root and turning into anxiety and depression and addiction and so many other things that we worry about. So I might write a book about college mental health. And I just actually sent an email to an editor about a totally different idea, more for adults as well, which is just like a mindfulness through the year, almost like a daily mindfulness 365, looking at like different themes over time through the seasons, because I've been more interested in nature and in the outdoors and the environment as well. So seeing where that could fit in, but mostly I'm having fun just playing with these ideas and being out there kind of doing teaching. And it's just so exciting. I mean, you know what it's like, Deirdre, to be able to share something that really is so powerful. for people, right? And I often will speak to teachers as well as therapists and parents, and you see people, you just see that little mindfulness light bulb go off, and it's just so exciting to see that and see people start to step in and deepen a practice and move toward a path of healing through mindfulness and through self-compassion and through good attachment-based work and through all that other stuff that they need. And whether it's starting young or starting at any age, right? It's such a privilege to be able to be a part of that on someone's path and someone's journey.
Well, one of the things I like about you venturing into older territory, like not just kids and teens, is that to bring that element of play that is so much a part of you. And it's so necessary in our world. And sometimes in mindfulness practice, we get very contained and very like there's a right way to do it. And I love you bringing this enlivened possibility to people.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I do think, for mindfulness to survive, we've got to lighten it up a little bit, and we've got to figure out how to create more community around it, which I think some of the next generations are doing after some of the first kind of generation of teachers here, at least in the States. I think we really need community and find ways to come together, not just sitting silently, but people are seeking something out. And when they're seeking something out, right, it's because something is missing. And often that's because of some things that have happened for them, but people are longing for connection.
Right.
They're longing for community. They're longing for corrective attachment experiences, right? And that's something that I think spiritual communities in some ways have offered in the past, or other, families have offered in the past. That's not always so true anymore as we become more fragmented. And it's a place that I hope anyway, the mindfulness world, the therapeutic world, the compassion worlds can start to create for people is really some spaces of safety and connection, and start to build communities. Because nothing will happen if we don't start building more communities and we're all just sitting silently in the same room. People are longing for deeper connection than just that. I think that's what some of the next mindfulness 2.0 and 3.0 will hopefully be offering.
Well, I love that you're leading us in that direction and finding ways to help us all get there. So thank you so much. And I'm aware of your chest and your cold, so I think we'll end it here. But pure delight. And please, everybody, check out Chris's website, which I will put in the notes below, but it's also drchristopherwillard.com.
Yep. That's me. And I post intermittently also on social media at Dr. Chris Willard, Dr. Chris Willard, on Instagram and Facebook. And what's the other one? Twitter. Sorry, my head's a little full of cold right now. Those are other places as well. So yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. Yeah.